Blackwood Mansion was said to be the safest place in New York. Armed security guards stood watch at every gate. Surveillance cameras covered every hallway. No one was allowed to step inside without the permission of the Mafia boss. But the danger did not come from outside. It came from inside the bedroom of a child who was 4 years old. Everything began with a sound Clara had never heard before. Not crying. Sophie never cried out loud. This was the sound of struggling, of impacts, of desperate, gasping breaths spilling out from a room that should have been deep in sleep long ago. When Clara opened the door, she froze where she stood. The child's blanket lay scattered across the floor. A teddy bear had toppled onto its side beside the bed. And sitting on the bed with Sophie was the woman Clara had never imagined would appear here at this hour. The Mafia boss's second wife. The child's stepmother. A white pillow was pressed tightly over Sophie's small face. Victoria's hands were not gentle. They were pushing down, harder, and harder still. Sophie's tiny legs kicked weakly beneath the blanket. Victoria's eyes held no warmth. They were ice-cold, empty, as if she was not looking at a child at all, but staring at something she hated down to the bone. "What are you doing?" Clara's voice tore through the night. The woman did not answer. She lifted the pillow, and before Clara could even breathe with relief, Victoria's hands clamped around Sophie's little throat. The girl could not cry out. She had never been able to. 4 years of silence, 4 years without a single word. And now, even a plea for help was stolen from her. Clara lunged forward in desperation, her whole body trembling. "Stop! You are going to kill her! He will hear it!" But Victoria only smiled. A slow smile, so cold it made the skin crawl. A smile that did not belong in this child's room. "He will not hear," she whispered. "He is far away." And this girl, her grip tightened. She cannot speak, so how could she scream? Clara grabbed Victoria's arm and yanked hard, frantic with fear. Victoria fell to one side. And in that moment, the thing no one expected happened. Sophie opened her mouth, and for the first time in 4 years, the little girl screamed. The scream split the night. The scream of 4 years of silence, 4 years of fear, 4 years of pain buried alive. It echoed down the halls, waking the entire mansion, exposing what the Mafia boss could never be allowed to know. And when Marcus Blackwood kicked open his daughter's door, when he saw the bruises stamped across Sophie's neck, when he saw the pillow lying abandoned on the floor, and his wife standing there with trembling hands, nothing in the Blackwood Empire would ever be the same again. Stay with me until the end of the video, because what the Mafia boss discovers in that room will make you question everything you ever believed about loyalty, motherhood, and the terrifying power of silence. If you feel this story touch your heart, please hit like and share it with the people who need to hear it. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories. Now, let us turn back time 6 months, to the day Clara Whitmore first set foot in the Blackwood Mansion. 6 months earlier, Clara Whitmore stood before the massive iron gates of the Blackwood Mansion, her heart beating out of rhythm inside her chest. Her hands tightened around an old, worn handbag, the only possession she had left after years of running from her past. She was 26 years old, yet her green eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived 100 years. The October wind tugged at her rough, tangled brown hair, cold as the memories she tried to bury. 18 years ago, a car crash stole her parents in a single stormy night. Clara was 8, sitting in the back seat, watching her mother and father die right in front of her, unable to do anything. She was taken to St. Mary's orphanage, where she learned the first lesson of her life. Silence was the only way to survive. Older children bullied her. Adults looked right past her. And Clara grew up in the shadow of loneliness. At 18, she left the orphanage with empty hands and a heart full of scars. She worked every job she could just to stay alive. Waiting tables, cleaning houses, babysitting, anything that could bring in a few dollars to get through the day. Then she met Daniel. He was handsome, sweet, and Clara, naive, believed she had finally found someone who would love her. But that love quickly became hell. 2 years living with violence. 2 years being beaten whenever Daniel got drunk. 2 years hiding bruises beneath long sleeves. She escaped on a rainy night, carrying a few changes of clothes and a long scar across her back that no one ever saw. But fate still did not let her go. Her younger brother, Tommy, the only family she had left, was diagnosed with leukemia. Clara worked 16 hours a day, sold everything she owned, borrowed every dollar she could to pay the hospital bills. But in the end, Tommy still slipped away, leaving her with a debt of $80,000 and a heart completely shattered. That was why she was here, standing at the gates of the Blackwood Empire, accepting a job with a salary so high it felt unreal, a job no one else wanted. The gates opened slowly, and a middle-aged man approached. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, His hair was threaded with gray. His face was stern, yet his eyes held a kindness Clara rarely saw in anyone. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Clara nodded. "I am Thomas, the Blackwood family's butler. Please, follow me." They walked along the stone path leading into the estate. Clara lifted her gaze to the enormous building ahead of her, awe tightening in her throat. The Blackwood mansion looked like a castle from another century, with towering white stone columns, stained glass windows that shimmered with color, and hundreds of rooms hidden behind cold gray walls. It was magnificent, lavish, but something about it made Clara shiver. Beautiful, yes, but lifeless, like a decorated tomb. "Miss Whitmore," Thomas said, and his voice suddenly dropped. "Before you meet the master, I need to tell you something." Clara looked at him and waited. "The child you will be caring for," Thomas said, and a flicker of sadness passed through his eyes. "The little girl is different." "Different how?" Clara asked. Thomas stopped and turned back toward her. "Sophie, Mr. Marcus's daughter, is 4 years old. She was a bright, talkative child until 2 years ago. Then, she stopped. Not a single word for 2 long years. The doctors call it selective mutism. She knows how to speak. The words are there, buried under a mountain of fear." Clara felt her heart draw tight. "Is she mute?" she asked. "No." Thomas shook his head. "She can speak, but she chooses not to. Or she cannot. The doctors call it selective mutism. But he hesitated. "I think the child is afraid of something." He started walking again, leaving Clara standing there with 1,000 questions racing through her mind. "7 nannies before you quit within 2 months, Thomas added, his voice darker now, not because the work was difficult, but because they could not endure the silence. The front doors of the mansion opened, and Clara stepped into a world that felt entirely different. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, hanging from a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear. Polished marble floors reflected her shadow like a mirror. Oil paintings covered the walls, portraits of cold-faced men staring down at her as if passing judgment. Everything was perfect. Everything was luxurious. Everything was expensive. But Clara could not feel warmth anywhere, only a chill that sank into bone, as if the mansion itself were trying to push her back outside. She did not know that 6 months later, she would be standing in a child's room, facing a devil wearing an angel's face, forced to choose between her own life and the life of a 4-year-old girl who had never spoken a single word. Thomas led Clara up to the 2nd floor, along a long, hollow hallway where painted portraits seemed to watch her every step. At the end of the corridor stood a white door, completely different from the heavy oak doors throughout the mansion. Golden stars and a silver moon were stuck to it, as if someone had tried to turn this place into a fairy tale world, but the stars had faded, and the moon was peeling away in flakes. Thomas stopped in front of the door and turned to Clara, his expression difficult to read. "She is in here," he said softly. "Please, be patient." Then he walked away, leaving Clara alone before the silent door. Clara drew in a deep breath, then gently pushed it open. The room unfolded before her like another world. It was spacious, flooded with light from tall glass windows, and packed with toys. Dolls stood in neat rows on shelves. Stuffed bears were piled high in a corner. A wooden rocking horse waited beside the window. And there were hundreds of other toys, more than Clara could count. It was the kind of room any child would dream of. But something was wrong. Clara felt it at once. This room was cold, not in temperature, but in feeling. The toys lay motionless, as if they had never been touched. There was no laughter, no playful shouting, no sign of life. This was not a child's room. This was a prison, decorated with toys. And in the farthest corner, near the window, Clara saw her. Sophie sat on the floor with her back to the door, her head bowed over a blank sheet of paper. Her golden hair spilled forward, hiding her face, and her tiny hand moved a colored pencil across the page. She did not turn around. She did not react, as if Clara did not exist. "Hello," Clara said, keeping her voice as gentle as she could. "My name is Clara. I will be here to take care of you from now on." No response. Sophie kept drawing, the pencil scratching softly against the paper. Clara stepped closer, careful not to make any loud sound. "What are you drawing? Can I see?" Silence. Only the pencil, and the wind moving past the window. Clara stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. She remembered what Thomas had said. 7 nannies before her had quit. They could not endure the silence. But Clara was not like them. Clara had lived in silence her entire life. She knew silence was not always rejection. Sometimes it was the only way to protect yourself. Instead of continuing to talk, Clara chose to sit down. She sat about a meter away from Sophie, Not too close to feel threatening, not too far to be ignored. She said nothing. She asked nothing. She simply sat there, quiet, like a presence that demanded nothing at all. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Sophie kept drawing, but Clara noticed the child's pencil had begun to slow. Then, suddenly, Sophie stopped. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening for something. And then, slowly, carefully, she turned her head. Clara held her breath as she saw Sophie's face for the first time. The little girl was beautiful. Big blue eyes like two clear lakes, porcelain pale skin, small, delicate lips. But those eyes did not hold the innocence of a 4-year-old. They looked older, guarded, filled with fear, carefully hidden. Sophie stared at Clara, as if trying to read her, trying to figure out who she was and what she wanted. That look made Clara think of herself, years ago, when she was an orphan at St. Mary's, the look of a child who had learned that trusting adults was dangerous. Clara did not speak. She only offered a small smile, one that asked for nothing in return. Then she looked down at the paper Sophie had been drawing on, and her smile went still. The picture was not what a 4-year-old should be drawing. It was a large house, colored in deep black. Inside the house was a tiny figure, curled up in a corner, and in the window, staring in from outside, was a pair of eyes. Eyes colored blood red, unnaturally large, fixed on the child inside. A chill ran straight down Clara's spine. This was not the picture of imagination. This was the picture of fear, real fear. Sophie looked at Clara once more, then turned back and kept drawing. She picked up the black pencil and began adding a hand. A large hand with long fingers, reaching toward the small, curled-up child in the corner of the house. Clara sat there, her heart pounding hard, and wondered what kind of place she had stepped into. Clara was still sitting beside Sophie, trying to make sense of the meaning behind that dark drawing, when the bedroom door suddenly opened. The sound of high heels tapped against the wooden floor in a steady rhythm. Slow, deliberate, full of authority. Clara turned her head and saw a woman step inside. She was tall and slender, with sleek black hair falling to her shoulders and flawless white skin. The red dress she wore hugged her perfect figure, and jewelry glittered at her throat, her ears, her wrists. She was beautiful, beautiful enough to make Clara feel like a stain in the middle of this dazzling room. But something in that beauty kept Clara from admiring it. It was cold, sharp, like a blade plated in gold. "Ah, you must be the new nanny," the woman said, her voice sweet, while her eyes swept over Clara as if she were judging a cheap object. "I am Victoria Blackwood, Marcus's wife." Clara rose and lowered her head politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Clara Whitmore." Victoria did not return the greeting. She walked past Clara, as if Clara did not exist, moving toward where Sophie sat on the floor. "Sophie, sweetheart," Victoria said, her voice suddenly turning so sugary it sounded false. "Mommy came to see you. Did you miss me?" Clara watched closely. Sophie did not turn around. The child's small body went rigid, her shoulders drawing inward, as if she were trying to become a stone. The pencil in her hand stopped moving. Victoria stood there for a moment, waiting for a response. When none came, her expression shifted, just slightly. For a single heartbeat, Clara saw something flash in Victoria's eyes. Not disappointment, not sadness, but disgust, quickly hidden. "This girl," Victoria said, turning to Clara, her smile still in place while her eyes were ice cold. "She never reacts. You will get used to it, or you will quit like the others." Then she walked out, the sound of her heels fading down the hallway. Clara watched her go, suspicion tightening in her chest. Something was wrong here. She did not know what it was, but the survival instinct honed by years of pain was whispering a warning. That woman was dangerous. An hour later, Thomas came to escort Clara down to the first floor to meet the master of the house. They passed through countless corridors and staircases before stopping at a heavy oak door. Thomas knocked, and a low, rough male voice came from inside. "Come in." Marcus Blackwood's office was as large as the entire apartment Clara had once rented. Books lined the walls. A massive wooden desk sat in the center, and behind that desk sat a man. Marcus Blackwood. Clara had heard plenty about him. About the shadow empire he ran. About enemies who vanished without a trace. About the absolute power he held. But nothing could prepare her for standing in front of him. Marcus was about 37 years old, tall, with broad shoulders and a body that looked carved from stone. His black hair was slightly long, slicked back from his face, revealing sharp angles, a square jaw, and eyes as dark as bottomless pits. He did not need to say a word. Just sitting there, he radiated a kind of authority that made Clara want to step backward. "You are Clara Whitmore," Marcus said. It was not a question. It was a statement. Yes, sir. Sit. Clara sat in the chair across from the desk, trying to stay calm even as her heart pounded wildly. Marcus studied her for a moment, his dark eyes seeming to read every thought inside her head. Then he pushed a thick folder toward her. This is my daughter's medical file, he said. You will read it carefully. Clara opened the folder, pages packed with text, complicated medical terms, endless psychological evaluations, and on the first page, a diagnosis printed in bold. Selective mutism. My daughter does not speak. Marcus continued, his tone still cold, yet Clara sensed something shift. A softening so slight it was almost impossible to notice. The doctors say it is selective mutism. She is capable of speaking, but she chooses not to. Or she cannot speak in certain situations. He paused, his jaw tightening. Sophie's birth mother died giving birth to her. Sophie has never known what a mother is. Sometimes I wonder. He hesitated, and for a brief moment, pain flickered in those dark eyes. Sometimes I wonder if she is punishing this world for that. Clara stayed silent, unsure what to say. For the first time, she saw the human being beneath the Mafia boss, a father suffering because he could not understand his daughter. A powerful man who could control an entire city, but could not make his 4-year-old child open her mouth and say a single word. I do not need you to cure her, Marcus said, his voice turning cold again. I only need you to keep her safe. Can you do that? Clara looked straight into those dark eyes. I can, sir. She did not know how far that promise would be tested. She did not know that keeping Sophie safe would not mean protecting her from the world outside. It would mean protecting her from the woman inside this very mansion. The first week passed slowly, like a dream that never ended. Clara woke at 6 every morning, prepared breakfast for Sophie, then helped her bathe, change her clothes, and begin another long day inside a room overflowing with toys, yet empty of laughter. Sophie did not speak. Not a single word. She moved like a small ghost through her own room, avoiding touch, avoiding eye contact. When Clara brought food, Sophie would wait until Clara turned away before she touched the plate. When Clara tried to brush her hair, Sophie would go stiff, like a small animal waiting for pain to come down on her. The child did not fight back. She did not scream. She did not cry. There was only silence. A silence more frightening than any sob. Clara did not force her. She had learned from her own life that forcing anything only made it worse. Instead, she chose to stay close. Every morning, she sat in the corner of the room, a few meters from Sophie, and simply existed there. She demanded nothing. She expected nothing. She only sat, quiet, like a patient stone waiting for the water to pass. Sophie kept drawing dark pictures. Clara saw more of them during that first week. Dark houses, eyes red as blood, black hands reaching out from the shadows. And again, the image of a tiny child curled in a corner, alone, with no one coming to save them. Clara did not ask about the drawings. She knew Sophie was not ready. But Clara memorized every detail, every color, every trembling line of the child's pencil. Something was happening to this little girl, something terrible, and Clara was determined to find out what it was. On the 3rd day, Clara began to notice a strange pattern. Every afternoon, around 4 o'clock, the familiar click of heels would sound outside the hallway. Victoria came to visit her stepdaughter. At first, Clara assumed it was normal. A mother visiting a child. What could be strange about that? But then she began to pay attention. Each time those heels appeared, Sophie stopped whatever she was doing. The pencil slipped from her hand. Her small body went rigid. Her blue eyes widened, filled with fear, fixed on the door. She did not tremble. She did not cry. But Clara could see the terror in every line of that small face. The terror of a child waiting for something awful to happen. Victoria always entered with a bright smile and a sweet voice. Sophie, sweetheart, I have missed you so much. Are you feeling all right? But Clara caught the strain beneath every word, every gesture. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. Those eyes were ice cold, sharp, looking at Sophie the way you look at an obstacle you despise. And every time Victoria moved closer, Sophie moved back, slowly, without drawing attention, but always keeping distance, as if she were backing away from a poisonous snake. Victoria never stayed longer than 10 minutes. She would stand there, speak a few lines in that falsely sweet voice, and then leave. But each time she left, Clara noticed Sophie needed a full hour to calm down. Her tiny hands shook, her breathing went fast and shallow, and the drawings afterward were always darker, more frightening, filled with blood-red eyes and hands reaching from the shadows. Clara knew something was wrong, but she had no proof, only instinct. And in the Blackwood world, the instinct of a poor nanny was worth nothing. At the end of the first week, Clara decided to try a different approach. She brought a book into Sophie's room, sat in her usual corner, and began reading out loud. It was The Little Prince, the story of a lonely boy from a faraway planet. Clara read slowly, her voice gentle, not expecting Sophie to react. She simply read, as if she were reading for herself. Sophie did not turn around. She did not lift her head. She kept drawing her dark pictures. But Clara noticed something. Sophie's pencil moved more slowly. Her small shoulders were no longer as tightly drawn as before. And when Clara reached the part where the little prince met the fox, the part about taming, about building a bond, Sophie stopped drawing completely. She did not turn around. But she was listening. Clara smiled and kept reading. This was the first step. Small, but it was progress. She did not know the road ahead would be long and full of thorns. She did not know Sophie's enemy was not the darkness in her drawings. It was the woman with eyes like ice. The woman watching Clara's every move from the shadows. The weeks that followed passed in the steady rhythm of patience. Clara read to Sophie every day. Sometimes The Little Prince, sometimes other fairy tales. Sophie never answered with words. But Clara began to notice small changes. The little girl started sitting closer. Not much, only a few centimeters each day, but enough for Clara to see it. The space between them was shrinking, little by little, like ice melting under a patient sun. In the third week, Clara decided to try something else. Instead of only reading, she began to tell Sophie about her own life. Real stories, no polish, no disguises. She told her about St. Mary's orphanage, about nights spent crying alone in the corner of the dormitory, about the feeling of being abandoned in a world too wide to hold her. Sophie still did not turn around, but her pencil stopped moving. She was listening. Clara knew it. Then one afternoon, when slanted sunlight poured through the window and covered the room in a warm golden glow, Clara told Sophie about Tommy. "I had a little brother," Clara said, her voice sinking as memory rushed back. "His name was Tommy. He was 4 years younger than me, and he was the only person in this world who made me feel like I was not alone." Clara paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "Tommy got sick. Very sick. I did everything I could to save him. I worked 16 hours a day, sold everything I owned, borrowed every dollar. But in the end," her voice caught, "in the end, I still could not keep him." The room fell into silence. Clara closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears rising fast. She did not know if Sophie cared, if Sophie understood, but Clara needed to say it. She needed someone to listen, even if that someone never answered. "The thing I regret the most," Clara went on, her voice a whisper, "is that I did not tell Tommy enough that I loved him. I kept thinking there would be time. I kept thinking I would say it tomorrow, and then one day, there was no tomorrow left." Silence. Then Clara heard a small sound, the soft rustle of paper. She opened her eyes and turned. Sophie had turned around. For the first time in 3 weeks, the little girl was looking straight at Clara. Those big blue eyes were no longer as guarded as before. They were softer, sad, in a way that felt too heavy for a child. As if she understood the grief Clara carried, they looked at each other in silence. No words were spoken, but Clara felt an invisible thread forming between them, a thread of lonely souls finding one another. From that day on, everything began to change. Sophie no longer avoided Clara. She still did not speak, but she allowed Clara to sit closer. Sometimes, while Clara read, Sophie would inch nearer until their shoulders nearly touched. Listening to every sentence, Clara began to draw with Sophie. She was not an artist. Her drawings were clumsy, messy little sketches, but she drew bright things. A sun, blazing gold, a field of flowers, full of color, houses with windows wide open to the light. She placed those drawings beside Sophie's dark pictures, saying nothing, judging nothing, only showing the child that the world was not made of darkness alone. Sophie watched. She studied Clara's drawings, her head slightly tilted, as if trying to understand. And then, one day, Clara noticed something miraculous. In Sophie's newest drawing, beside the familiar red eyes and black hands, there was a tiny streak of yellow in the corner. A sun, small, faint, almost impossible to see, but it was there. On the 72nd day, while Clara sat reading as usual, Sophie suddenly stood up. The little girl walked toward Clara, her steps so light they barely made a sound, and stood there for a moment. Clara stopped reading and looked up. Sophie held a sheet of paper, her blue eyes fixed on the floor, as if gathering every bit of courage she had. Then she held the paper out toward Clara. Clara took it, and her heart felt as if it stopped. The picture was no longer dark. It showed 2 people, one tall and one small, holding hands. The taller one had brown hair, like Clara, The smaller one had blonde hair, like Sophie, and above them, a large sun shone brightly. Tears rose in Clara's eyes, but she forced them back. She did not want to frighten Sophie. "It is beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Sophie stood there, watching Clara, as if waiting for something. Then, slowly, very slowly, the little girl reached out her hand. A tiny hand, soft, shaking, and for the first time, Sophie touched Clara's hand on her own. It was only a light touch, like a butterfly landing on a flower. But to Clara, it was the whole world. Clara held that small hand gently, carefully, as if she were holding a fragile treasure. And for the first time in 72 days, Clara saw Sophie smile. A small smile, quick as lightning, but it was there. Clara did not know that somewhere in the mansion, eyes cold as ice were watching them through the security cameras, and those eyes were burning with jealous rage. The 89th day, Clara would never forget that day, even if she lived another 100 years. That afternoon, gentle autumn sunlight streamed through Sophie's window, laying a warm golden veil over everything it touched. Clara sat on the soft rug, her back against the foot of the bed, continuing the final chapter of The Little Prince. Sophie sat beside her, closer than ever, their shoulders nearly touching, listening to every word. This had become their routine for nearly 3 months. Clara read. Sophie listened. No words were exchanged, yet the silence between them was no longer heavy as it once had been. It had grown warm, familiar, like the embrace of an old friend. Clara reached the part where the little prince said goodbye to the fox, and her voice softened as she read the lines she knew by heart. One sees clearly only with the heart. What is essential is invisible to the eye. She paused and turned the page, ready to continue. Then she felt a small hand touch her own. Clara looked down. Sophie was holding her finger, and those wide blue eyes were lifted to Clara's face with something Clara had never seen there before. Not fear, not suspicion. Trust. Complete, unconditional trust. "Sophie?" Clara whispered, setting the book aside. Sophie opened her mouth. Her small lips trembled, as if she were fighting some invisible force. Her throat worked, trying to push sound out into the world. Clara held her breath, her heart beating wildly. She knew what was happening. She knew the child was trying, and she prayed. She prayed to whatever power might be listening, to give Sophie strength. Sophie stopped, her face tightening as if it hurt. Then she drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried again. Clara. One word. A single word. One word. A single word. But it shattered 2 years of suffocating silence. 2 years of burying her voice in the dark because she was told the world wasn't safe for her words. Clara stood frozen, unable to believe what she had heard. She stared at Sophie, her eyes wide, tears rising before she even realized it. "You. What did you just say?" Sophie looked up at her, her own blue eyes shining with tears. Then she opened her mouth again, her voice still trembling, still rough from not being used for so long, yet clearer this time. Clara, stay, okay?" And Clara cried. She cried the way she had never cried before. Tears streamed down her cheeks, fell onto her hands, fell onto the open book resting on her lap. She did not hide it. She did not hold it back. She simply cried. From happiness, from relief, from the knowledge that 3 months of patience had finally meant something. Sophie cried too. For the first time, Clara heard her cry out loud. Not the cry of fear, not the cry of pain. The cry of a child who had finally found someone she could trust. Clara pulled Sophie into her arms and held her tight. The small body trembled against her, but it was no longer stiff the way it used to be. Sophie leaned into her, searching for comfort, allowing herself to be weak. "I will stay," Clara whispered into Sophie's golden hair. "I promise. I am not going anywhere." They sat that way for a long time, holding each other in the afternoon light, 2 lonely souls who had finally found their way to one another. From that day forward, Sophie began to speak. Only single words, only with Clara, and only when they were alone, hungry, tired. Book. Clara. Each word was a small victory. Each word was a brick, rebuilding trust that had been shattered long ago. But Clara also noticed something that unsettled her. Sophie could speak. She was not mute. Her voice was not broken. She had chosen not to speak. Or, more truthfully, she had not dared to speak. One evening, while Clara was putting away toys, Sophie suddenly grabbed her hand. "Don't," the little girl whispered, her eyes full of fear. "Don't talk. Victoria, no." Clara went still. "Know what, Sophie?" Clara asked softly. Sophie shook her head, her lips trembling. "Victoria, no, Sophie, talk. Victoria hurt Sophie." Clara's heart felt crushed in an instant. Everything began to fit together. The mysterious bruises, the terror in Sophie's face whenever she heard Victoria's footsteps, the dark drawings with blood-red eyes. Sophie was not silent because of illness. Sophie was silent because of fear, and that fear had a name. Victoria Blackwood. Clara looked at Sophie, fury and heartbreak rising together inside her. She did not know exactly what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Someone was hurting this child, and Clara would find the truth, even if it cost her life. Victoria Blackwood was not a woman easily fooled. She had lived in the world of the powerful long enough to sense when something shifted, and something was shifting with Sophie. She realized it one morning, as she passed the dining room and happened to see Sophie eating breakfast. The child usually only picked at a few bites and left the rest untouched. But today, she was finishing her entire plate of pancakes. Not only that, she was smiling. Smiling. Sophie, the child who never showed emotion, the child who always wore an empty face like a doll, was smiling. Victoria stood in the shadow of the hallway and watched. Clara sat beside Sophie, saying something Victoria could not quite hear. Sophie lifted her head to look at Clara, and her smile grew brighter. Rage flared inside Victoria, hot as dynamite. 2 years. 2 years she had tried. 2 years of playing the perfect stepmother, buying Sophie the most expensive toys, hiring the best tutors, creating the image of a woman who adored her husband's child with all her heart. And that child had never looked at her the way she looked at Clara. Not once. Victoria began to watch. She watched through the security cameras, lurked behind doors left slightly open, listened for every conversation, and she saw everything. She saw Sophie sitting close to Clara while the nanny read. She saw Sophie reach for Clara's hand on their walks in the garden. She saw Sophie smile, truly smile, when Clara said something funny. 3 months. That poor nanny had needed only 3 months to do what Victoria could not do in 2 years. It drove Victoria mad. One afternoon, Victoria stood in Marcus's office, looking out the window at the garden below. Clara and Sophie were there, sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree. Sophie was drawing something, and Clara sat beside her, watching. Then Sophie handed the picture to Clara. Clara looked down, and her face lit up. She said something, then pulled Sophie into a hug, and Sophie hugged her back. That child, the child who shrank whenever Victoria came near, was holding the nanny as if she were the most important person in the world. Victoria felt her nails sink into her palm, sharp with pain. She looked down and saw blood seeping from the red marks in her skin, but she did not care. The fury was burning her from the inside out, swallowing every trace of reason. Why? Why would that child choose a nameless nanny instead of her? Victoria was Marcus Blackwood's wife, the mistress of this empire, the most powerful woman in New York, and Clara was nothing but a poor girl with a troubled past, someone with nothing to her name but cheap clothes on her back. Yet Sophie chose Clara. That was unacceptable. Victoria remembered why she had married Marcus. Not for love. Love was a luxury women like her could not afford to believe in. She married Marcus for power, for money, for the position he could give her. But there was a problem. Sophie, the dead wife's child, the child Marcus loved more than anyone in the world. As long as Sophie was here, Victoria would always stand second in Marcus's heart. She had tried to win Sophie's affection, believing that if the child loved her, Marcus would love her more. But Sophie never gave her anything back. The child looked at her with fear, flinched whenever she came near, and stayed silent like a fortress wall that could not be broken. Victoria had tried everything. Kindness, strictness, threats. Nothing worked. And now, a nameless nanny had done what she could not. Victoria looked down at the garden again. Clara and Sophie were standing now, hand in hand, walking back toward the mansion. Sophie was saying something to Clara, her lips moving, and Clara bent down to listen. The child was talking to Clara, not to her, never to her. Victoria's face twisted. Her dark eyes turned even darker, filled with hatred, filled with jealousy, filled with a fury she could no longer contain. She had endured enough. Enough. If Sophie could not love her, if Sophie chose someone else over her, then Sophie would pay the price, and that nanny would too. Victoria turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her eyes cold as ice, while inside her, a cruel plan was already boiling. She would not let anyone steal what belonged to her. No one. The next morning, when Clara came to Sophie's room to wake her as usual, she knew something was wrong. Sophie was already awake, curled up in the corner of the bed, her blue eyes fixed on nothing at all. She did not turn when Clara entered. She did not smile the way she had in recent days. She only sat there, unmoving, like a small wax statue. Clara stepped closer, worry tightening in her chest. "Sophie, are you all right?" Sophie did not answer. She only shook her head slightly, her blonde hair falling forward to hide her face. Clara sat beside the bed and gently lifted the sleeve of Sophie's nightgown to check. And she froze. On Sophie's small arm, just below the elbow, was a bruise. Not the kind of bruise a child gets from a simple fall or bump. This bruise had a clear shape, as if someone had grabbed her arm and squeezed as hard as they could. 5 fingers. Clara could count 5 fingerprints pressed into Sophie's porcelain pale skin. Clara's heart slammed hard in her chest. She forced her voice to stay calm, not wanting to frighten Sophie. "Sophie, who hurt you?" Sophie began to tremble. Her whole body shook, like a leaf in a storm. She shook her head, faster and faster, wild with fear, her eyes wide. "No," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "No talk. Can't talk." Clara wanted to ask more. She wanted to know who had done this, but she understood that forcing it would only make everything worse. Sophie was terrified enough that she could not say the truth. And fear like that did not appear on its own. Someone had made her afraid. Someone was hurting her. From that day forward, Clara began to watch. She observed everything, memorizing the smallest details, and she discovered a terrifying pattern. Every time Victoria visited Sophie, a new bruise appeared the next day, sometimes on her arms, sometimes on her legs, sometimes in hidden places no one would see unless they were looking on purpose. And every time Victoria came, Sophie changed. She shrank back. She pulled into her shell. She stopped speaking to Clara for the entire day. The progress they had built over 3 months was erased overnight. Clara began to listen for footsteps. In a mansion this large, everyone had their own rhythm. Thomas walked slowly, steady, and quiet. Marcus walked fast, strong, full of command, but Victoria's heels on marble made a sound that cut the air, sharp as a knife striking a butcher's block. Each time that sound appeared in the hallway, Sophie stopped whatever she was doing. It did not matter whether she was drawing, reading, or eating. She stopped instantly. Her small shoulders went tight, her breathing turned quick and shallow. Her blue eyes widened with terror, locked on the door as if she were waiting for a monster to walk in. And Sophie's drawings grew darker. Clara had believed that once Sophie started trusting her, the pictures would brighten. For a while, that had been true. The sun began to appear. Bright color began to slip into the corners of the page. But now, the darkness was returning. Stronger, more frightening. Blood-red eyes showed up in every drawing. Watching from windows, from corners, from beneath the bed. The eyes of nightmares. The eyes of a hunter. And the black hands with long, crooked fingers, reaching out of the dark, trying to touch the tiny child curled in the corner of the picture. Clara gathered the drawings and hid them beneath her own mattress. She did not know if they could ever serve as proof, but she knew they mattered. They were Sophie's voice, the voice she was too afraid to speak out loud. One night, when the entire mansion had fallen asleep, Clara slipped up to Sophie's room to check on her. She stood outside the door and listened, and she heard it, crying, quiet, strangled sobs, as if the one crying was doing everything possible not to make a sound. Sophie was crying alone in the dark. Clara wanted to rush in, to hold her, to tell her everything would be all right, but she knew she could not promise that, not while she still did not know who the enemy truly was, not while she still had no proof. She stood there, her back against the cold wall, listening to the sobs of a 4-year-old child carrying something terrible that no one else could see, and she swore to herself. She would find the truth. She would protect Sophie, no matter who she had to face. Clara began her own investigation. Every night, after making sure Sophie was asleep, she would slip out and stand in a shadowed corner of the hallway, watching. She knew she was taking a reckless risk. In the Blackwood world, curious people rarely lived long enough to regret it. But Clara had no other choice. She could not close her eyes while a child was being tortured right in front of her. On the 3rd night, Clara finally saw what she had been waiting for. The clock struck 2 a.m. when the familiar click of heels echoed through the dark corridor. Victoria, wearing a white silk nightgown, she moved toward Sophie's room. No bodyguards followed her. No one saw her. Only darkness and silence. Clara hid behind a marble statue, holding her breath, her heart pounding out of control. She watched Victoria stop at Sophie's door, her head tilting slightly, as if listening. Then the door opened, and Victoria disappeared inside. Clara waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Then she heard it. Crying. Sophie's muffled, strangled sobs, smothered, as if someone were covering her mouth. Clara wanted to rush in. She wanted to drag Victoria out by force. She wanted to protect Sophie at any cost, but reason caught her and held her back. If she stormed in now, Victoria would deny everything. There would be no proof, no witnesses, and the word of a poor nanny meant nothing against the Mafia boss's wife. Clara needed evidence. evidence that could not be denied. 10 minutes later, Victoria stepped out of the room, her face cold as ice, her eyes lit with something poisonous. She walked down the hallway, her heels ringing through the night, and vanished into the dark. Clara waited another 5 minutes to be sure Victoria was gone, then slipped into Sophie's room. Sophie lay curled into herself on the bed, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her whole body trembling. Her eyes were squeezed shut, but tears still ran into the pillow. Clara sat beside her and gently laid a hand on Sophie's hair. "I am here," she whispered. "Sophie, I am here now." Sophie opened her eyes, and Clara saw the horror inside that blue gaze, the horror of a child who had endured too much, for too long, alone. The next day, when Sophie went outside into the garden with Thomas, Clara stayed behind to clean the room. She knew what she was looking for, and she found it. Under Sophie's bed, hidden behind a loose board, was a stack of drawings. Pictures Sophie had kept secret, not wanting anyone to see. Clara pulled them out, and the blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. These drawings were different from the ones she had seen before. They did not only show vague red eyes and black hands, they showed a woman with long black hair, wearing a red dress, with eyes colored blood red. That woman was hurting a child. In one drawing, she was yanking the child by the hair. In another, she was pinching the child's arm. In yet another, the child was trapped in a dark room, and the woman stood outside the door, laughing. Victoria. This was Victoria. Clara did not need anyone to confirm it. The long black hair, the red dress, Victoria Blackwood. Sophie had drawn the truth she was too afraid to speak out loud. Clara slid the drawings into her pocket, determined to find a way to use them, but she did not know she had been watched. When she turned around, Victoria was standing in the doorway, her dark eyes fixed on Clara like a predator. "What are you looking for, Clara?" Victoria asked, her voice sweet, but carrying the threat of death beneath it. Clara forced herself to stay calm. "I am just cleaning, ma'am." Victoria stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The sound of it shutting was like a trap snapping closed. "You know, Clara," Victoria said slowly, "I really do not like curious people. Curious people tend to have accidents." Clara said nothing. She knew any word she offered could be turned against her. "You are only a nanny," Victoria continued, moving closer. "A poor nanny. No family. No one who cares. If you disappeared tomorrow, would anyone even bother to look for you?" She stopped right in front of Clara, her black eyes locked on hers. "Remember your place, Clara. You are here to work, not to stick your nose into other people's business. If you want to keep living, learn to close your eyes and keep your mouth shut." Then Victoria turned and walked out, leaving Clara standing there with her heart racing and the drawings weighing heavy in her pocket. Clara knew she was facing a choice: stay silent and live, or speak up and die. But when she thought of Sophie, of those frightened blue eyes, of bruises on porcelain skin, she knew she had no choice at all. That night, as Clara stood on the balcony staring out at the garden drowned in darkness, a hand touched her shoulder. She startled and spun around, her heart racing, then let out a breath when she realized Thomas was standing there. The old butler looked at her with worry in his eyes, then motioned for her to follow him. They walked down an empty hallway, slipped down a back staircase, and stopped at a small room behind the kitchen. It was Thomas's quarters, the only place in the mansion without surveillance cameras. He closed the door, checked the room, and only then turned to Clara. "You are playing with fire," Thomas said, his voice low and heavy with unease. "I saw the way Mrs. Victoria looked at you today. You did something that made her angry." Clara did not deny it. She knew there was no point in lying to a man who had lived in this house for 20 years. Thomas sighed and sank into an old chair in the corner. "Do you know how many nannies there have been before you?" 7, Clara answered. "You told me on the first day." "Yes, 7. Thomas nodded, and pain flickered through his aged eyes. "And do you know what happened to them?" "They were all fired. Every one of them. For the same reason." A chill slid down Clara's spine. "What reason?" "Defaming Mrs. Victoria," Thomas said slowly. "Each one of them, after some time working here, began to suspect. They saw the bruises on Sophie. They saw the way the child flinched when Mrs. Victoria came near. They reported it to Mr. Marcus." Thomas paused and swallowed hard, and every one of them was dismissed. "Mrs. Victoria always finds a way to turn them into liars, troublemakers, people who cannot be trusted. Mr. Marcus believes his wife. He always believes his wife." Clara felt the hope inside her beginning to crack. If the 7 before her had failed, how could she be any different? "There was one more," Thomas continued, his voice trembling. "The 6th nanny. Her name was Martha. She did not only report it to Mr. Marcus, she threatened to call the police. He looked Clara straight in the eyes. Martha disappeared 3 days later. No one found her. Not ever. Clara felt the blood in her body turn cold. You mean... I do not mean anything, Thomas cut in, fear sharpening his words. I am only telling you a story. A story you should remember. He stood, stepped closer, and lowered his voice. Miss Clara, I have watched you these past months. You are a good person. You truly care about Sophie. But you must understand who you are up against. Thomas's voice dropped to a near whisper. Victoria did not marry Mr. Marcus for love. She married him for money, for power, for status. And she will not let anyone, not even a 4-year-old child, stand in her way. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. Stay silent and live, or speak up and die. That is your choice. But remember this. If you die, there will be no one left to protect Sophie. Then Thomas opened the door and walked out, leaving Clara alone in the small room with 1,000 chaotic thoughts. She thought of Sophie, of frightened blue eyes, of dark drawings, of muffled sobs in the night. She thought of the 7 nannies before her, of Martha, who had vanished without a trace. She thought of Victoria's threat, of the debt of $80,000 pressing down on her shoulders. Stay silent and live, or speak up and die. Clara stood there for a long time, staring at the blank wall. Then she thought of Tommy, of her brother dying in her arms, of the last promise she had whispered to him. I will live a life that means something. I promise. A life that meant something was not a life spent silent in the face of evil. Clara closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath. She had made her decision. 2 days after her conversation with Thomas, Clara received a message from Victoria. A small slip of paper had been placed on her pillow when she returned to her room after dinner. My private room. 10 o'clock tonight. Do not be late. There was no signature, but Clara knew exactly who it was. She recognized the faint trace of expensive perfume clinging to the paper, the scent Victoria always wore like a mark of power and luxury. At exactly 10 that night, Clara stood before the door to Victoria's private quarters in the east wing of the mansion. She knocked, and the familiar sweet voice came from inside. Come in. Victoria's room was 3 times the size of Clara's, decorated with costly furniture and walls covered in framed art. Victoria sat in a red velvet armchair beside the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, her dark eyes watching Clara the way a cat watches a mouse already trapped in a corner. Sit, Victoria ordered, pointing to the chair across from her. Clara sat, keeping her face calm even though her heart was pounding wildly. She knew this confrontation was coming. She simply had not expected it to come so soon. Victoria took a slow sip of wine, in no hurry at all, as if savoring the feeling of complete control. Then she set the glass down and picked up a thick folder. Do you know what this is, Clara? Victoria asked, her voice still sweet, but her eyes cold as ice. Clara did not answer. She only stared at the folder, unease rising in her stomach. This is your life, Victoria said, opening it and turning the pages one by one. Clara Whitmore, 26 years old, orphaned at 8, raised at St. Mary's. She looked up at Clara, a poisonous smile spreading across her lips. Not exactly a pleasant childhood, was it? Clara clenched her hands, her nails biting into her palms. She knew Victoria was trying to unbalance her, and Clara refused to let it happen. At 22, you began dating Daniel Morrison, Victoria went on, her voice full of cruel satisfaction. An interesting relationship. You were abused for 2 years, were you not? Hospital records, police reports. Oh, and you also have a record yourself. Disorderly conduct. You hit a man in a bar. Clara felt her face burn. That was the night she escaped Daniel, the night she struck his friend when he tried to stop her from leaving. She had been arrested, held for a night, and stamped into the system as a troublemaker. Then your brother died, Victoria said, pretending sympathy. How tragic. And he left you with a debt of $80,000. You are desperate, Clara. Desperate enough to do anything for money. Victoria closed the folder and laid it on the table, then rose and stepped directly in front of Clara. She leaned down, her face only inches away, her warm breath brushing Clara's skin. Now imagine this, Victoria whispered. A poor nanny with a criminal record, drowning in debt, suddenly discovered trying to kidnap the daughter of one of the most powerful men in New York. She plans to sell the child to the Blackwood family's enemies, or demand ransom to pay off her debt. Victoria straightened and smiled. Who would believe you, Clara? A girl no one knows, with a stained past, against Marcus Blackwood's wife. How do you think that battle ends? Clara felt as if someone had tightened a hand around her throat. Victoria had calculated everything. She had prepared a perfect story. A story anyone would believe. A greedy, desperate nanny trying to exploit a wealthy family. Who would stand on Clara's side? No one. This is your choice, Victoria said, turning away and walking toward the fireplace. Stay silent, do your job well, and you will keep receiving your monthly salary to pay your debt. Or open your mouth, and you will lose everything. Your job, your freedom, perhaps even your life. She turned back to Clara, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Now get out of my room. Clara stood, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. She left Victoria's room, walked through the dark hallway, and did not stop until she reached her own room. She sank onto the bed, trembling, her thoughts spinning. Victoria was right. Clara had nothing. No family, no money, no power. She was only an unknown nanny with a past full of stains. But then Clara thought of Sophie, of those trusting blue eyes, of the small hand holding hers, of the whispered words, "Clara, stay." Okay? She could not leave. She could not abandon Sophie to face the devil alone. Even if it cost her everything, she would stay. A week after the confrontation in Victoria's private room, Clara began to feel something changing in the mansion. The air grew heavier, as if a storm were gathering on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. And Clara knew the storm had a name: Victoria Blackwood. That morning, Marcus announced he had to leave on an urgent business trip to Chicago. An important meeting with partners, he explained, as Clara happened to pass through the breakfast room. Victoria sat beside her husband, her face arranged into false worry, her hand clasped around Marcus's. I am so worried, darling. Is this trip dangerous? Victoria asked, her voice so sweet it made Clara feel sick. Marcus patted his wife's hand. It is only business. I will be back in 2 days. But Clara saw Victoria's eyes when Marcus turned away. Those dark eyes flashed with triumph, like a cat watching its rival step straight into a trap. Clara knew Victoria had arranged this trip. She wanted Marcus far away, and that frightened Clara more than anything. That afternoon, while Clara was playing with Sophie in her room, Thomas came in with news that made Clara's blood turn cold. The security camera in Sophie's room has malfunctioned, he said, his voice low and filled with concern. The technicians say it will take a few days to repair. Clara looked up to the corner of the ceiling, where the small camera usually blinked red. Now it was dark, useless, like an eye that had been stabbed blind. This was not coincidence. Marcus gone, the camera broken, 2 events on the same day. Victoria was clearing the path for something. All day long, Clara could not take her eyes off Sophie. She stayed beside the child every second, watching every shadow that passed the hallway, listening for every sound that moved through the mansion. Sophie seemed to sense something wrong as well. She clung to Clara more than usual, her blue eyes darting again and again toward the door, as if waiting for someone to appear. Clara, Sophie whispered late in the afternoon, her voice trembling. Sophie scared. Clara pulled her into her arms, trying to comfort her even though fear was tightening in her own throat. I am here. I will not let anyone hurt you. Night fell. Clara put Sophie to bed as usual. She read to her until Sophie drifted to sleep, then stayed a long while longer, watching the angelic face in the soft glow of the nightlight. Clara did not want to leave. Her instincts were screaming, warning her that something terrible was coming. She decided she would not return to her own room. Instead, she took a blanket and sat down in the corner of the hallway, just outside Sophie's door. If anyone tried to enter, Clara would know. The mansion sank into silence. The clock struck 11, then midnight. Clara sat in the dark, her back against the cold wall, her eyes fixed on Sophie's door. She was so tired her eyes felt full of sand, but she did not dare sleep. Not tonight. 1 in the morning, 2, and then Clara heard it. Heels. That familiar click, coming from the stairwell, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a hunting animal closing in on its prey. Clara held her breath and pressed herself tighter against the wall, hiding inside the darkness. She saw Victoria appear at the end of the hallway, her silhouette thrown across the wall by pale moonlight spilling in through a window. Victoria was moving toward Sophie's room. She wore a white nightgown, her black hair falling to her shoulders, drifting down the corridor like a ghost. And in her hand, she carried a white pillow. Clara felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She knew what Victoria intended to do. She knew tonight was the night Victoria had chosen to act. Victoria stopped at Sophie's door, her head tilting slightly, as if listening. Then she opened the door and stepped inside. Clara rose, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She had to do something. She had to stop this. But if she charged in right now, what would Victoria do? She might kill Sophie instantly before Clara could intervene. Then Clara heard it. Struggling. Toots. Desperate, ragged breath spilling out from the room. There was no time left to think. Clara sprinted to Sophie's door and threw it open, and what she saw made the blood in her body turn to stone. Victoria was sitting on Sophie's bed, a white pillow pressed tight over the child's face. Sophie's tiny legs kicked weakly beneath the blanket, growing weaker with every passing second. Clara burst into the room like a storm. She did not have time to think. She did not have time to weigh consequences. Her instinct to protect Sophie swallowed her whole, driving her legs faster than they had ever moved. She grabbed Victoria by the shoulders and yanked hard, pulling the woman off Sophie's bed. Victoria hit the floor. The pillow flew from her hands, and at last, Sophie's ragged breathing filled the room. She was alive. Sophie was alive. Clara lunged to the bed and pulled the child into her arms. Sophie's face was flushed red, her lips tinged purple, her small throat working frantically to draw in each painful breath. But she was alive. That was all that mattered. "You dare!" Victoria snarled from the floor, her voice twisted with fury. "You dare interfere in my business." Clara held Sophie tight and backed into the corner of the room, her eyes never leaving Victoria. She knew the real fight was only beginning. Victoria was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat. Victoria rose slowly, like a snake coiling before it struck. Her black hair spilled over her face. Her eyes gleamed with something unhinged beneath the pale moonlight. She no longer looked human. She looked like a devil finally showing its true shape. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "A poor nanny no one cares about, standing between me and what I want." Clara did not answer. She only pulled Sophie closer, shielding the small body with her own. Sophie trembled in her arms, her breathing still fast, but she clung to Clara as if she were clinging to life itself. "I warned you," Victoria went on, stepping closer. "I gave you a chance to stay silent and live. But you did not listen." Victoria's hand slipped behind her back. When it came forward again, steel flashed under the moon. A box cutter, a small blade, but razor sharp, sharp enough to leave wounds that could kill. Clara felt her blood turn cold. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself, only bare hands, and the decision to protect Sophie at any cost. "Now the plan has to change a little," Victoria said, her voice turning terrifyingly calm. "Instead of a peaceful death in her sleep, Sophie will die because a crazed nanny attacked her. And you, Clara, you will take your own life after realizing what you have done." She laughed, a cold sound in the night. "Perfect, isn't it? No witnesses, no one left to tell the truth." Victoria lunged, the blade aimed straight for Clara. Clara twisted on instinct, shielding Sophie, and she felt the blade slice deep into her left shoulder. Pain exploded like fire, and hot blood soaked through her nightgown. But Clara did not let go of Sophie. Even when the pain made her want to scream, she held on, using her own back as a shield for every blow. Victoria pulled the blade free and raised it again. Clara fell to the floor, Sophie still locked in her arms. Blood dripped from Clara's shoulder onto the wooden boards, pooling into a dark red stain. Clara looked up and saw Victoria lifting the blade high, her dark eyes blazing with madness. This was the moment she would die. Clara knew it. She could not fight a woman with a weapon. Not while she was wounded. Not while she had to protect a child. But she did not regret it. If she had to die, she would die protecting Sophie. She would die as someone who had lived according to her conscience. Clara closed her eyes, held Sophie tighter, and waited for the final strike. "Don't be scared," she whispered into Sophie's ear, her voice trembling with pain and fear. "I love you. I will always protect you." But the strike never came. Instead, the unimaginable happened. Sophie, the child who had gone 4 years without speaking a word, suddenly lifted her head, and she screamed. The scream tore through the night, echoing through the mansion, waking every hidden corner of the house. Not a scream of fear finally breaking loose. A scream of 4 years of silence. 4 years of endurance. 4 years of pain, at last exploding into sound. Victoria froze, the blade suspended in midair. She had not expected this. She had believed Sophie would stay silent forever, that no one would hear, that no one would come. But she was wrong. Sophie's scream woke the entire mansion. Lights snapped on in nearby rooms. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. And the most terrifying sound of all, for Victoria, was the heavy, commanding set of steps racing up the stairs. Marcus. He was back. Victoria heard Marcus's footsteps drawing closer, and something inside her shattered. The perfect mask she had worn for 2 years fell away, revealing the true face of a woman pushed to the edge of madness. She stopped trying to hide, stopped playing the perfect wife, the loving stepmother. All those layers dissolved, and only the raw, terrifying truth remained. "Do you have any idea what I have endured?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling, her dark eyes lit with a fevered, deranged glow. The knife was still in her hand, but she was no longer trying to strike. She was talking now, spilling everything she had kept locked inside for so long. Clara held Sophie tighter, blood still flowing from the wound in her shoulder, but she did not dare move. She knew Victoria was balanced on the edge of insanity, and even the smallest motion could send her over. 2 years, Victoria went on, her voice breaking as if she were crying, though no tears fell. 2 years I have lived in this house, slept in that bed, been Marcus Blackwood's wife, and do you know what? I have never truly been his wife. She turned toward Sophie, hatred twisting her face. Because of this child. This damned child. Victoria began pacing the room, her steps unsteady, like someone drunk. Do you know how Marcus looks at her? Like she is his whole world, like the sun rises and sets for her alone. And me? She laughed, a bitter sound sharp enough to cut. I am only decoration. A beautiful woman to attend parties, to lie in his bed, to fill the empty space his first wife left behind. Victoria stopped at the window. Moonlight washed over her face, highlighting features that were both beautiful and frightening. But I could never fill that space, because Caroline is still here. She turned back and pointed the knife toward Sophie. She is in every corner of this house. In every photograph, every object, every story the servants whisper to each other. And most of all, she is in that child. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Sophie as if she were staring at an enemy. Every time Marcus looks at Sophie, he sees Caroline. Those blue eyes, that blonde hair, everything is just like her mother. And me? Her voice caught. I disappear. I do not exist. I am only a faint shadow beside a woman who is already dead. Clara listened, horror filling her. She began to understand. Victoria was not only jealous of Sophie, she was jealous of someone who had died 4 years earlier. A woman Victoria could never defeat, because the dead remain perfect forever. I tried, Victoria continued, her voice rising, growing more frantic. I tried to love her, tried to be her mother, tried to make Marcus look at me the way he looked at Caroline. But she never accepted me. She looked at me with her mother's eyes, and she hated me. She hated me because I am not Caroline. Marcus's footsteps reached the end of the hallway. Only seconds now. But Victoria no longer cared. She had lost control completely. So, I decided, Victoria said, and her voice turned terrifyingly calm. If I cannot defeat Caroline, I will remove everything that reminds him of her, starting with this child. She stared at Sophie, then turned her gaze to Clara. The plan was simple. Sophie would die in her sleep. Sudden infant death syndrome, the doctors would call it. Marcus would suffer, and I would be there to comfort him. In the end, he would have only me. Only me. Victoria turned to Clara, her eyes cold as ice. But you ruined everything, so now the plan must change. She spoke as if reading from a script already memorized. You, a crazed nanny with a troubled past. You attacked Sophie. I tried to stop you, but I was too late. Sophie dies. You kill yourself from guilt, and I become the poor wife, the woman who tried to save her husband's daughter and failed. She laughed, wild and echoing through the room. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. The bedroom door flew open. Marcus Blackwood stood there, his face drained of color, his dark eyes taking in the scene with a horror he could not hide. And Victoria, with the knife still in her hand and her confession hanging in the air, stood frozen in the center of the room, realizing it was over. Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face pale as carved stone. He had not gone to Chicago after all. A father's instinct, the instinct of a man who had survived countless plots and betrayals, had whispered that something was wrong. He had ordered his driver to turn back in the middle of the trip, to bring him home at the fastest speed possible. And now he was here, staring at a scene that looked like it had crawled straight out of hell. But Victoria was not the kind of woman who surrendered easily. In a single instant, her face transformed completely. The madness in her dark eyes vanished, replaced by fear and suffering performed to perfection. The knife slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor with a sharp metallic ring. She rushed toward Marcus, tears pouring down her cheeks like a river. "Marcus!" Victoria screamed, choking on her sobs. "You got here just in time." "Clara, she is insane. She tried to kill Sophie." Marcus stood frozen, his dark eyes sweeping over the room, trying to understand what he was seeing. He saw Clara in the corner, blood soaking through the fabric at her shoulder. Sophie cradled in her arms. He saw the white pillow on the floor, the bruises stamped across his daughter's small throat. And he saw Victoria, crying, shaking, playing the victim flawlessly. "Look, Marcus," Victoria went on, lifting her arm for him to see. On her smooth white skin were red scratches, shallow wounds that Clara knew Victoria had inflicted on herself when no one was watching. Clara attacked me when I tried to stop her. She has lost her mind. She wanted to kidnap Sophie. She wanted ransom. Victoria clung to Marcus's arm, tears sliding down her face. I warned you about her. A poor nanny with a troubled past. I knew she could not be trusted. I knew she was plotting something. And tonight, I was right. Clara watched, despair rising inside her like a tide. She knew exactly what this looked like. Victoria, with tear-filled eyes and marks on her arm, looked like a brave woman who had risked everything to save her husband's daughter. And Clara, with blood on her clothes and Sophie in her arms, looked exactly like what Victoria described, an attacker caught in the act. Clara opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to beg Marcus to believe her. Then she stopped. What could she say? What would her words be worth against Victoria Blackwood? She was only a poor nanny, a nobody with a past full of stains. Victoria was Marcus's wife, the mistress of this empire, the woman Marcus had trusted for 2 years. So Clara chose silence, not because she had given up, but because she knew her voice would be meaningless. She only held Sophie tighter, feeling the little heart racing against her chest. No matter what happened, she would not let go of Sophie. Marcus looked at Victoria, then at Clara, then back at Victoria again. His face gave nothing away, his dark eyes deep as 2 bottomless wells. He said nothing. He only stood there, as if trying to process everything at once. Marcus, you have to call the police, Victoria said, her voice still shaking but steadier now. Clara needs to be arrested. She is a danger to our family. To Sophie. She moved closer to Marcus and pressed her hand to his chest, the gesture of a wife seeking protection. I am so frightened, Marcus. If I had not arrived in time. She did not finish the sentence, letting Marcus imagine what could have happened. She sobbed into his shoulder, performing the role of the helpless victim perfectly. Clara watched them, bitterness burning in her throat. She thought of the 7 nannies before her, the ones who had tried to speak the truth and failed every time. She thought of Martha, who had disappeared without a trace. She thought of Thomas's warning, stay silent to live. Victoria always wins. Maybe this was the end for her. Maybe she would be arrested, thrown in jail, or worse, vanish like Martha. Maybe everything she had done meant nothing. But then Clara felt something. Sophie shifted in her arms. The little girl lifted her head, and those blue eyes were no longer drowned in fear. They held determination. The determination of a child who had finally found the courage to face her nightmare. Sophie looked toward her father, the most powerful man she knew. The father she loved but had never dared to speak to. And she opened her mouth. Daddy, Sophie said. The word was small, but clear, and it rolled through the silent room like thunder. It was the first word she had ever spoken to her father in 4 years. Victoria froze, her face turning white as paper. Marcus went still, his dark eyes widening, unable to believe what he had just heard. And Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, because she knew everything was about to change. Marcus Blackwood had heard many sounds in his life. Gunfire in wars over territory, the begging of enemies before they vanished for good, the cries of his first wife as she gave birth to Sophie, and then released her final breath in his arms. But no sound could compare to his daughter's voice in this moment. Daddy. One word. Only one. It shattered the 2 years. Marcus believed his daughter had lost her voice forever. 2 years of burying her voice in the dark because of the trauma she endured. 4 years in which he had missed what was truly happening beneath his own roof. Marcus turned to Sophie, and for the first time in 4 years, he truly looked at his child, not through the glass of endless work, not with the pity reserved for a disabled little girl. He looked with the eyes of a father trying to understand, and he saw it. He saw Sophie lying in Clara's arms, not because she was being restrained, but because she was seeking protection. Sophie's tiny hands clutched Clara's nightgown, not in panic, but as if Clara were the only lifeline in a storm. Sophie's blue eyes did not look at Clara with the terror they held for Victoria. They looked at Clara with trust, absolute trust. Victoria sensed the shift in Marcus at once. She stepped forward, trying to pull his attention back to her. Marcus, don't listen to her. She's in shock. She's been manipulated by Clara. Be quiet, Marcus said, his voice low and cold as ice. Victoria froze, her mouth open, but no sound coming out. In 2 years as Marcus's wife, she had never heard him speak to her like that. It was the voice he saved for enemies who were about to be dealt with. Marcus moved toward Sophie, slowly, as if afraid of frightening her. He knelt in front of her, his dark eyes level with his daughter's blue ones. It was the closest they had been in years. Sophie, Marcus said, and his voice trembled in a way his men would never believe possible. Can you tell Daddy what happened? Sophie looked at her father, her small lips shaking. She had been silent for 4 years, not because she could not speak, but because she was afraid. Afraid of Victoria, afraid of punishment, afraid no one would believe her. But now, looking into her father's eyes, seeing real pain and real worry there, something shifted inside her. She was not afraid anymore. She had Clara. Clara had protected her. Clara had not run. Clara had been willing to die for her. And now, maybe her father would believe her too. Sophie opened her mouth, and the words she spoke changed everything. Victoria hurts me, Sophie said, her voice still rough from not being used, but clear and steady. Always. Victoria hits me. Victoria pinches me. Victoria locks me in the closet when no one is looking. Tears began to slip down Sophie's cheeks, but she did not stop. Victoria says if I talk, Victoria will kill me. Victoria says no one will believe me. Victoria says I'm useless, a burden, something everyone hates. Marcus felt as if someone were tearing his heart apart piece by piece. His daughter, the child he loved more than his own life, had endured all of this under his roof, and he had not known. He had not seen. He had been too busy with business, with the empire, with meaningless battles for power, while his daughter was being tortured right in front of him. But Clara came, Sophie continued, and her voice warmed when she spoke of the nanny. Clara doesn't make me talk. Clara just stays. Clara reads to me. Clara draws with me. Clara tells me about Tommy, her brother who died. Sophie turned to Clara, her blue eyes full of gratitude. Clara loves me. Clara saves me. Tonight, Victoria wanted to kill me, but Clara saved me. She looked back at her father, her voice small, but brave. Daddy believed me. Daddy believed Clara? Marcus did not answer with words. Instead, he reached out and touched Sophie's cheek, the first time in years. And the most powerful mafia boss in New York, the man the city feared, began to cry. Tears slid down his sharp face and fell onto the wooden floor, mixing with Clara's blood, and the pain of 4 years kept hidden. I believe you, Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. He pulled Sophie into his arms, holding her as if he might lose her again. And Sophie, for the first time in 4 years, hugged her father back. She cried in his arms. Finally safe. Victoria stood there watching it all, her face white as a ghost. She knew it was over. Marcus gently placed Sophie back into Clara's arms, then stood. His face changed completely. The pain, the collapse of a father who had just discovered a horrifying truth, was gone. In its place was the coldness of the mafia boss, the man who had built an empire with blood and iron, the man who never forgave betrayal. He pulled out his phone and made a short call. Dr. Hayes, I need you at the mansion immediately. And bring all your forensic examination equipment. Victoria stared at Marcus, searching for even a sliver of hope. Marcus, what are you doing? You cannot believe the words of a child and a crazy nanny over your own wife. I am your wife. Marcus turned to Victoria, his dark eyes like ice. How stupid do you think I am, Victoria? The question stopped her cold. She looked at him, not understanding. Marcus stepped closer, each footfall heavy in the silent room. You think I built this empire by trusting everyone around me? You think I survived how many assassination attempts? How many betrayals? On luck alone. He stopped in front of her, his face only inches from hers. I suspected you since Martha disappeared, but you had erased every trail with terrifying precision. I hired Clara as a final test, hoping her bond with Sophie would force you to make a mistake. I never imagined you would go as far as attempted murder while I was away. I had you watched, Marcus continued, his voice cold as steel. I put hidden cameras in places you never expected. And I kept a backup of every camera feed in this house, including the ones you thought were broken. He pulled out his phone again, opened a video, and held it up for Victoria to see. On the screen, Victoria stood in Sophie's room, a pillow in her hands, pressing it down over the child's face. The date and timestamp were clear in the corner of the image. Tonight, only minutes ago. The camera in Sophie's room was never broken, Marcus said. You only destroyed the main camera. But I have a backup camera. I always have a backup plan. Victoria staggered back, her legs threatening to give out. Everything she had calculated, every perfect story she had built, collapsed in an instant. The doorbell rang. A few minutes later, Thomas led a middle-aged man in a white coat into the room. Dr. Richard Hayes, the most renowned pediatric forensic physician in New York, the one Marcus trusted completely. Examine my daughter, Marcus ordered. I need to know every injury on her body. Dr. Hayes stepped to Sophie and Clara, and examined the child with the careful precision of a specialist. He checked Sophie's throat, where the bruising from Victoria's hands was still clearly visible. He checked her arms, legs, back, and the places clothing usually concealed. With each discovery, Marcus's face darkened further. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Hayes said at last, his voice low and grave. "The child has multiple injuries at different stages of healing. Some bruises are old, possibly from several weeks to several months ago. Some are newer, only a few days. And the bruising to the throat is the most recent, from only minutes ago." He looked Marcus straight in the eye. "These are not accidental injuries. These are injuries caused by deliberate violence. Someone has been abusing this child for a long time." Marcus closed his eyes, struggling to contain the fury boiling inside him. His daughter had been harmed for months, maybe years, and he had not known. He had trusted Victoria, left her alone with Sophie, believed she was a good stepmother. "No!" Victoria screamed, her voice wild. "This is a lie. Clara did all of this. She hurt Sophie, and now she is blaming me." She rushed toward Marcus and grabbed his shirt. "Marcus, I am your wife. I love you. I would never hurt Sophie." But Marcus only looked at her, his dark eyes empty of all feeling. "Do you know why I came home early tonight?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. The main camera was indeed disabled, but the hidden backup system triggered a silent alert to my phone, but the signal was delayed due to the storm. I saw the shadow on my screen only as I reached the front door. I ran as I have never run before, every second feeling like an eternity of failure. Sinks time. Victoria froze, every excuse dying in her throat. Her mask had fallen completely. No more fake tears. No more sweet voice. Only the true face of an evil woman, exposed in the light. And she knew, in Marcus Blackwood's world, there was no forgiveness for anyone who dared lay a hand on his family. The room sank into a heavy silence. Marcus stood across from Victoria, his face stripped of expression. No anger. No pain. Not even disgust. Only the cold emptiness of a man who had made a decision that could not be reversed. Victoria stared at her husband, searching for the smallest hint of mercy in those deep black eyes. She found nothing. Only darkness. The darkness of death. Waiting. "Marcus," Victoria said, her voice shaking. "We can talk. I can explain." "Disappear." Marcus cut her off, his voice cold as ice. 2 words. Only 2. But they carried the weight of a death sentence. Clara, still holding Sophie in the corner, felt a shiver race up her spine. She had heard Thomas speak of people who disappeared from Marcus Blackwood's world. They were never found. Not ever. "You cannot do this," Victoria said, panic rising fast. "I am your wife. I am Victoria Blackwood. You cannot treat me like some ordinary criminal." Marcus did not answer. He only stood there, looking at her with eyes that no longer recognized the woman he had married. Victoria changed tactics. She dropped to her knees at Marcus's feet, tears spilling out, her hands gripping his legs like a drowning woman clinging to the only thing that might keep her above water. "Marcus, please, I will change. I will do anything you want. I will love Sophie like my own child. I swear it. I swear it to you." She sobbed openly, tears and mucus mixing together. The face that had once been beautiful, now twisted by desperation. "Think about what we had, 2 years together. The nights you held me in your arms. The things you said to me. You loved me once. You loved me." Marcus still said nothing. His silence was more terrifying than any words. Victoria realized begging would not work. She stood, her eyes red and swollen, and something in her shifted completely. No more tears. No more pleading. Only cruelty and hatred. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" Victoria screamed. "I know all your secrets. I know about the dirty deals. I know about the people you have killed. If you lay a hand on me, I will tell the police everything. I will destroy your empire." Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his mouth. Not a happy smile. The smile of a predator watching prey with nowhere left to run. "You think you are the first person to threaten me, Victoria?" he asked, his tone calm in a way that was terrifying. "You think the ones who tried to bring me down before are still out there somewhere?" Victoria backed away, her face turning paper white. She realized she had chosen the wrong enemy. Marcus Blackwood was not the foolish husband she could manipulate. He was a wolf, wearing a man's skin, and she had made him angry. Marcus lifted a hand. As if they had been waiting for that signal, the bedroom door opened. 3 men stepped inside, dressed in black suits, their faces blank. Clara recognized them. They were Marcus's closest guards. The ones Thomas had said only appeared when someone needed to disappear. "No!" Victoria screamed, darting toward the window. But 2 of the men grabbed her, wrenched her arms behind her back, and locked her in place. "Marcus, you cannot do this. I am your wife. I am your wife." Victoria screamed and thrashed, fighting against the iron grip of those men. It was useless. They dragged her toward the door, and Victoria kept screaming, her voice echoing down the dark hallway. Marcus stood there, watching his wife being taken away, his face untouched by emotion. When Victoria's screams finally vanished into the night, he turned toward Clara and Sophie. "She will never come back," Marcus said, his voice tired. "The official story is that she ran off with a lover. No one will ask further questions." Clara nodded and said nothing. She understood. In Marcus Blackwood's world, disappear did not mean moving to another city or starting over somewhere new. It meant ceasing to exist, forever. She felt no pity for Victoria, not after everything that woman had done to Sophie, but she felt no joy, either. Only a strange, quiet relief, as if a massive shadow had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Sophie lay in Clara's arms, her blue eyes closed at last. For the first time in 4 years, she fell asleep in peace. 1 year later, the Blackwood mansion no longer felt like a cold place. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, laying a warm golden glow over everything. Children's laughter rang through the hallways. Laughter that, a year earlier, no one believed they would ever hear. Sophie, now 5 years old, was running through the garden, her blonde hair flying in the wind, her blue eyes bright with happiness. She was no longer the child who curled into corners, drawing dark pictures. She had come back to life, like a flower that finally reached sunlight after years in the shade. Clara stood on the second-floor balcony, watching Sophie play, her heart filled with peace. A year ago, she had been a poor nanny with an $80,000 debt crushing her shoulders. Now she was the official legal guardian of Sophie Blackwood, recognized by law, trusted completely by Marcus. Her debt had been paid off long ago. Marcus never spoke of it. One day, Clara simply received a notice from the bank saying the entire loan had been paid in full. Clara knew it was Marcus's way of saying thank you, the way a man did when he was not good at speaking his feelings out loud. Sophie began to talk more, not only with Clara, like before, but with Marcus too. Every evening, when Marcus came home from work, Sophie would run out to meet him, calling "Daddy" in her clear, bright voice. And the most powerful mafia boss in New York, the man who made the entire city afraid, would kneel down, gather his daughter into his arms, and smile. A smile no one would have believed possible a year earlier. Marcus had changed. He no longer drowned himself in work the way he once had. He made time for Sophie. He read to her before bed, took her to the park on weekends, learned how to be a real father. He was still the boss. Still ran his empire with an iron hand. But when he stepped into the mansion, he became someone else. A father who loved his daughter more than anything. The relationship between Clara and Marcus changed too. Not romantic love, the kind found in fairy tales, but deep respect, wordless gratitude, and a rare bond built from that fateful night. Marcus looked at Clara as someone who had saved what was most precious to him, and Clara looked at Marcus as a father who had finally awakened and learned how to love his child the right way. One afternoon, Sophie ran to Clara with a sheet of paper in her hands. Her blue eyes shone with excitement. "Clara, I drew something for you." She handed Clara the picture, and Clara felt tears rise as she looked at it. The drawing no longer held dark houses, no blood-red eyes, no black hands reaching out of the shadows. Instead, there was a bright yellow house, its windows thrown open wide to the light. In front of it stood 3 people holding hands, a tall man with black hair, a woman with brown hair, and between them, a little girl with blonde hair. Above the picture, in a child's uneven, crooked letters, Sophie had written one word: family. Clara pulled Sophie into her arms, tears sliding down her cheeks. This was everything she had ever dreamed of. Not money, not status, but belonging somewhere, being loved, being needed. And she had found it in the one place she never expected, in the mansion of a mafia boss, beside a little girl who had gone 4 years without speaking a single word. Marcus stepped out onto the balcony and watched them holding each other. He said nothing. He only stood there, a faint smile resting on his mouth. And in that moment, beneath the blazing gold of sunset, they were a family. Not a family by blood. A family made from love, sacrifice, and courage. This story teaches us that sometimes the hero is not the most powerful person, or the richest. Sometimes the hero is simply an ordinary person who dares to stand up for what is right, even when danger is close. Clara had no money, no power, but she had a brave heart and unconditional love. And sometimes, that is all it takes to change someone's life. This story also reminds us that silence is not always golden. Sometimes, silence is the loudest cry for help, and listening, truly listening, is the most precious gift we can give another human being. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, tap like, and share so we can spread meaningful messages every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it bring anything in your real life to mind? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what is deepest in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health and a life that feels joyful and peaceful each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.